So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the International Association of Strategy Professionals National Capital Area Chapter in conjunction with IASP's Government Community of Practice. This has been an Arthur series I've been doing for a series of years now as president of the NCA chapter. And with us today is Donald Kettl, a very experienced and knowledgeable, not only academic, but in terms of consulting, helping to work across the aisles, agencies, public and private partnerships to solve tricky, big problems. And his book, along with William Eggers, is called Bridgebuilders, and he's going to talk us through that book today. And then we'll have some Q&A, and if you have questions, you can put them into the chat box, and we'll make sure that we get to them as well, since we'll have another dozen or so to come in. Let's see. So a lot of words on this page. You probably saw a brief outline of Dr. Kettl's bio. He was at the University of Maryland, which gave him a great insight into working with federal agencies, and especially the Partnership for Public Service here, as well as the Brookings Institute. He's won numerous awards, and he's written many books that many in the upper echelons of government, at least at the federal sector, have always used to help ground themselves in what good public administration is all about. With me today is also the head of the Government Community of Practice, Woody Stanley. Woody, would you like to say hello to everyone? You're on mute, Woody. All right, still on mute, but that's okay. Great. So Don, I'm going to stop sharing, and if you want to share your screens, whatever you have, please do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just get set up here in a second. Oh, there's a magic, let's see, there's a magic option here with my Mac, which allows me to share the slides and pop me in the corner, on the theory that seeing less of me may be better than paying more attention to the slides may be actually a plus in all this. So thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chance to be able to pay attention to some of these important issues here. I'm glad to have a chance to be able to not only share the ideas, but more importantly, have a chance to be able to talk with all of you about what I think is one of the truly most important issues that we're facing in trying to figure out how to deliver public programs. And so I appreciate this chance to be able to talk with all of you here. I want to talk about the book that Bill and I have written called Bridgebuilders, and review some of the new strategies for collaboration that government not only makes possible, but that government requires. So the important point here that I want to make, and I'm just going to skip to the conclusion, is that too often that we're operating under a model of government that doesn't work, doesn't match the way that government actually behaves when it behaves well, and that it needs to be the way that, in fact, more of government operates more often. And this theory that we have is a notion of bridge building, of trying to find ways of making connections among those who are responsible for delivering governmental programs. There was an interesting blog that was posted yesterday, or the day before actually, by Catherine Barrett and Richard Green, and they talked about the struggle that they have with the work that they're doing on state and local government in particular, looking at why it is that people just don't pay more attention to the fundamental questions of management that in the end determine how well government works. Why is it that people just don't pay attention to it? And as a result, the corollary is, why don't we pay more attention to the things we need to do to try to make government work better? That's the basic puzzle that actually Bill and I spend our time working on. And we've got an idea about why. But first, a bit of background. We've, for a long time, have had models that have gotten in the way of the way in which the society develops, maybe should, maybe ought to, too often doesn't. There was an interesting story about why it is that it's taken so long for the big challenges that we have in government to try, in particular, to advance maybe the role of electric cars. And it turns out that part of the problem had to do with government itself getting in the way of the innovation process. Back at the end of the 19th century, there actually was the invention of an electric automobile device. You can see it up there at the top. And it turns out that it actually wasn't too shabby, but it turned out to have lots of barriers put in front of it. One of the barriers, in fact, had to do with the fact that, and this was in England, that if somebody was driving an electric car, there's just horror at the idea of what it might bring, and in particular, whether or not it might scare people and horses. And so to be able to prevent that from happening, the regulation by government was that all electric cars had to be preceded by somebody in a uniform waving a red flag to warn everybody that an electric car was coming. And when there were multiple red cars, and it turns out, you can see at the bottom that there was a gentleman who was walking down the street holding on to his hat in a windy English day and waving the red flag, saying that there are lots of electric cars coming. The real story here is that too often we have images about the way that things work, the way that things ought to work. Sometimes, in fact, the mistakes about the way in which we approach innovation and the delivery of government programs and services that get in the way of genuine, positive, interesting thinking about what it is that should happen. So that's an important puzzle. The fundamental part of the puzzle now, we think, is that government is operating on the same kind of problems of a model that doesn't fit the reality. That in particular, I think the fundamental problem is, and this goes, I think, for the reason why people don't pay more attention to management and to the delivery of government programs. It has to do more fundamentally as well with the basic challenge of figuring out what it is that we need to do to make government programs work better, which is what I'm going to be spending most of the rest of the time talking about, is that we have an outdated model here. And the outdated model is a vending machine of government. We tend to think of government, we being often policymakers, certainly the media, many citizens as well, as a kind of vending machine. We put money in the top, that's the tax dollars. We push the button, maybe we want, say, law enforcement or perhaps human services to deal with the problems of homelessness. And then we wait for the services to come popping out. It's a kind of vertical model. It's a very mechanistic model. It has to do with a simple input-output model where we put money in and wait for things to come out, and it doesn't match the way that things operate. And even worse is the problem that when problems inevitably come up in the administration of governmental programs, and they always come up in the administration of governmental programs because government does complicated things in complex ways, that the thing to do is either to sometimes just kick the machine on the side. And to tell you the truth, I had a computer once upon a time where that's what I needed to do. So I just had to whack the side of the computer to get the fan to pay attention to it. So sometimes that's sort of the instinct that people have, just whack the thing on the side, maybe it'll work better. Maybe we don't like the machine, we'll kick it and dent it because we just think it's just a crazy way to operate. Or if people have a different approach that is more mechanistic, they'll just pop into the inside of the machine, try to adjust the levers and the knobs and all the rest to try to make it work better. But again, it's all based on the folly that government operates in a vertical sense with a simple translation of inputs and outputs, and where the key is if you create a new program, you just put another button on the vending machine and wait for things to work. None of that is the way that things actually operate. And the reason is because of a fundamental proposition. And this is something that I remember the good old days of the Johnny Carson show, late night, used to play Stump the Band. Is there something that you can play that you won't be able to guess? It turns out, for the life of me, I just cannot think of any program that matters that any one organization can solve. And I would ask all of you if you could think of anything, and if you can, just put it in the chat, any program that matters that any one organization can control. And in fact, I just don't think there's anything. Think of Social Security, maybe as simple a matter as we can imagine, where you put money in the top, you qualify people on the inside, the checks get distributed, but they get distributed through a system that works on the automated check clearinghouse system. And so the private sector is heavily involved in translating the inputs into outputs. If you look at anything that's more complicated, more sophisticated, it turns out that it's much more complex. Even the process of air traffic control, where we have thousands of air traffic controllers around the country, that depends on the National Weather Service and the weather forecasts about how you need to route planes around storms, how you try to get people safely to the ground. It has to do with communication through a radio system to the to planes and the pilots. There are new systems that allow the planes to self-control. And so there's, in some ways, an effort to try to take the controllers a little bit out of the system to streamline the system. There's nothing that I can imagine, nothing that I've ever been able to think of that creates a problem that any one organization can control. And so as a result of that, what we need are people who are good at the process of making the connections among those elements to be able to make sure that things happen. Because by definition, modern government operates through a system of networks instead of a horizontal top-down input-output model where you think about programs being managed by a government. Instead, what happens is a system where you work through a horizontal process involving different organizations, each of which has a piece of the solution. And the key is having bridge builders who can make the connection among those pieces, who can see beyond organizational boundaries, break down the existing silos, find in all the diversity ways of getting diversity and unity, and then ultimately seeking mutual advantage by aligning the incentives of all the players. This has gone back a long ways. You can look at, for example, a whole collection of some of our favorite bridge builders here, but one of them is Clara Barton, who during the Civil War found a way as a non-soldier, as a non-physician, to improve the way in which battlefield injuries were treated by developing new strategies that proved enormously successful. And from there, she went on to found, of course, the American Red Cross, which is one of the great examples of a horizontal bridge building organization for the last more than 150 years. You can look at Thad Allen, who came in after Hurricane Katrina had just destroyed a large part of the Gulf Coast, and where government was being savaged by a series of claims that it was just not performing well. And he came in and turned things around, not by focusing on managing the program, managing an agency, which was largely the reason why the government had not been responding effectively up to that point, and did the following. He came in on the first morning after he had been appointed as the president's chief officer to try to solve the problem, stood up on top of a desk, grabbed a megaphone because nothing else was working. There's no electricity, talking to a group of people who had been criticized for the government's response for days on end and whose morale was poor, and said, I have two things to say to you. First, I want you to treat every person you encounter as if they're a member of your own family. And secondly, I want you to know that if you get any guff, I've got your back. And so in a heartbeat, what he did was to change the system on a dime, and did it by focusing not on, I'm here to manage the program, but I'm here to manage the problem. By focusing on telling people that they're empowered to treat everyone as if they're members of their own family meant that they went out to try to find the resources that were needed and to pull them together to try to solve the particular problem, which meant that different issues demanded different solutions, and different solutions required capacity from different organizations. All of these folks are, and you can see a great collection of them across the board there, all of them are people who have discovered ways of managing government in a horizontal fashion to try to improve the way government worked. One of the ways to try to think about it is, we think, thinking about government, and especially the bridge building function, more as a symphony orchestra than as a vending machine, instead of thinking about it as a kind of horizontal a vertical top-down system. Rather, it's a system of where we have solutions for the government programs and problems that are focused on trying to find ways of building capacity. Think about how an orchestra works. Great orchestras in particular work by saying, we need to get ourselves some terrific violinists, but we don't expect our violinists to play the flute. We don't expect our flutists to be good on the cello, or the cellos to be able to play the timpani. We have people in the back playing the harps, and in the meantime, we have the brass, and we create the capacity for creating great music by finding people who are really terrific at the individual pieces that they need, and we get solutions by bringing it all together. but how do we translate the work of all these great individual orchestra players into a pleasing, even great performance of music? And it has to do with the orchestra conductor, who's really the bridge builder for bringing all these different pieces together. And it involves everything from the private sector and nonprofits on the one side, local governments and academia, even on occasion, the federal government and other players who are out there doing what needs to be done to play great music, and to play great music by having a orchestra conductor whose job it is to bring all the pieces together. So let me sort of poke around and explore this a little bit more. There are essentially 10 basic principles that we found in the book that are necessary for making bridge building work. And let me say that these are not 10 principles that somehow just sort of sprang out of our head. These are 10 principles that we derived from looking at people who had succeeded in doing government's work well, and what is it that they did to make it work. They knocked down the barriers that often get in the way between organizations, and did that by asking the organization leaders and the members of the players to seek mutual advantage by, and especially nurturing partners, sometimes in the private sector. It requires as well trustworthy networks among those individuals, with government's role less as a director of services and more as a catalyst. A system that focuses on outcomes rather than just producing outputs, instead of just saying, I'm just going to sit there and play my violin the way that I want to play it. The question is my violin contributing to the overall piece of music that we're trying to play? Data turns out to be critically important as the language for building these relationships, and that in turn redefines accountability by using this language to focus on outcomes. We need cross-boundary leaders who are good at being able to manage this. And too often we say, oh, this is great because, for example, Thad Allen did this amazing job in New Orleans, but he did it only because he was Thad Allen, and only because he was in the middle of response to a hurricane. And our basic argument is that the way in which people handle exceptional problems like that ought to become the routine way in which people throughout government and throughout those who contribute to the public service get the job done. So let me give a couple of examples. One is that one thing we know for sure is you look around and read the headlines that cities across the country are struggling to make headway in the issue about homelessness. We've got a real problem here where we've got, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless, and we're struggling trying to find a way to get at this. But one of the things that I want to point to is that one city has actually done a pretty good job, and that city is Houston. Houston, since 2011, has reduced its homeless population by 63%. And the city has placed more than 25,000 of its homeless residents in housing. So let me repeat that, 63% reduction in homelessness over the last dozen years. That's an incredible, astounding record, and one that any city in the country would be proud to have, and other cities have struggled to get to and haven't been able to. If we'd been able to do this across the country, we would have seen a kind of dramatic reduction in the number of people who are homeless from roughly 600,000 to more like 365,000. We would have been able to dramatically reduce the rolls of those who are homeless. In 2011, Houston had one of the nation's largest homeless populations, but they said, we're going to try to solve this problem. We're going to try to solve this problem first by making sure we understand the problem. Instead of just saying, well, people are homeless, what do they need? Well, they need permanent homes. We're going to build homes and hope that it solves the problem with a kind of one-stop solution. But it turns out that that's not the case, because they've done some research, and about 40% of the people who are homeless now for the first time. There's an assumption that all of the people who are homeless have mental health problems, but many of them are homeless because they've lost jobs. Some of them have lost their homes because they're in the middle of spousal abuse issues and have needed to try to run to escape, to get into a shelter. Some people have a lack of decent health care. And there's one story about a person who had a choice between either staying in the home, paying the rent, and giving up the much needed cancer care for their spouse, or living in a car to be able to save enough money to be able to pay for health care. The reasons why people are homeless are varied, But what Houston did was to start by understanding what the problem was for each individual, developing a system for matching that individual to the resources they had in the community, by developing a data system that allowed the tracking of each individual through the system, and ultimately to, they hoped, permanent housing, and whether or not the housing stayed permanent. And then the performance of individual organizations playing their own particular role in the symphony orchestra designed to try to reduce homelessness. So they started out with a system that was disjointed, duplication, service gaps, not surprising because that's a story repeated across the country. And as the former mayor said, different organizations were all working in their own lanes, according to their own rules and their own procedures, doing what they wanted to do. And little wonder that Houston was having trouble. But Houston decided to change the way in which it happened. And we have a problem not unique to Houston. And just get a sense of the scale of the problem. The greater Houston area, which is essentially the catchment basin for trying to solve this problem, is larger than the square mileage in the entire state of New Jersey. And so it's hard enough in a small community to make coordination work, but they did it by trying to focus on devising strategies to coordinate, communicate, analyze data, and relay information effectively. The key to Houston's effort was weaving together its partners. Now, as I said, what they did is to try to recognize this as an echo of what it is that Thad Allen did. We have Mike Nichols, who was the head of the Houston Coalition for the Homeless, who was the orchestra conductor in chief for what happened in Houston. Houston made an organized effort, he said, to look at solutions as opposed to just managing the problem. Instead of managing programs, they sought to understand the needs of particular individuals by looking at the population, looking at the nonprofits who might be involved, looking at the role of government, looking at other parts of the ecosystem, including nonprofit service providers, and then creating a data system to tie them all together so that they can, in fact, talk to each other. What is truly unique is not only the basic data system that, as I said, made it possible to track each individual person experiencing homelessness on the journey from identification through a reduction of 63% of those experiencing homelessness into permanent housing. So tracking individuals on the one side, but also matching those individuals to the particular service needs that each of them had, and using that to try to advance performance. What's even more interesting is that this happened first with an orchestra conductor who himself was head of a nonprofit, wasn't a city official, but was responsible for coordinating the city's and actually the region's response. And in addition to that, had more than 100 partners who were involved in this effort. Think about that, more than 100 partners. Now, if you look at symphony orchestras, except for a couple of very rare pieces of music, the largest symphony orchestra is nowhere near 100 players. And so the people in Houston managed to create beautiful music, and in a way that piece of music was far more complicated than anything that Beethoven or Bach might have written, and doing it by weaving together these 100 different organizations, by matching each one to the particular needs of each individual along the way. And the result, as I suggested, was truly impressive. Another case that I want to bring up is the story of Lieutenant Michael Day and the story of 9/11. A lot of folks probably have not heard this story, but it's one that even Tom Hanks has talked about in a really fascinating video that's posted on YouTube. It turns out that when the planes hit the towers, and then when the towers came down, there not only was the tragedy of the tremendous loss of life, but also a real crisis, because a lot of people tried to run as fast as they can, as far as they could, away from the towers as they fell. But what that meant was a large number of people ended up trapped between the towers and the debris and the fires and the smoke and the Hudson River and New York Harbor. They were stuck, and there was no way for them to get out because the roads were closed, the subways were shut down, buses couldn't get in, transportation was at a standstill. So what to do to try to help these people who numbered about 500,000 who were stuck there? And the answer, as it turned out, was to organize a boat lift, and it turned out to be the largest boat lift since Dunkirk. The massive effort during World War II to rescue Allied soldiers off the beach and Dunkirk. And how did this happen? Well, at first it was willy-nilly. There were boats that were coming in from everywhere. There were ferries, there were private boats, there were pleasure craft, there were tour boats, there were dinner cruise boats, so all trying to stream to the scene once they heard about the problem. But the problem was that the boats were in need and danger of bumping into each other. You get a sense here of just how much traffic there was back and forth. And Lieutenant Michael Day was at the Coast Guard looking at his window as the planes were struck over in Brooklyn. And as a lieutenant, he came to the scene and then used the Coast Guard's assets not only to provide its own boats, but to organize the process of getting people off the southern tip of Manhattan. The problem not only was just evacuating them, but if you were, for example, living in Connecticut and stuck at the southern tip of Manhattan, taking you off to Staten Island was of no help whatsoever, because then you had to get all the way over to your home in Connecticut, and transportation was in chaos that day. So not only did they succeed in getting 500,000 people off the southern tip of Manhattan, but did so in a way that prevented the assets from crashing into each other. And just look how close some of those boats are. You can see what a risk there was. But then taking different people to different places so that once they got away from the southern tip of Manhattan, they could actually get home. So what they had was Dunkirk in an afternoon, a remarkable series of efforts that was a result of the training that Michael Day had received. The training that he had received was a result of the Coast Guard's effort to create bridge builders in all of its officers that then became the model on which Thad Allen based his efforts to try to help put the southern part of the United States back in shape after all this happened. And the question sometimes is, okay, this is an interesting kind of effort, but does this really have anything with lasting value? Can it ever be good for somebody's career? Well, Lieutenant Michael Day is now Admiral Michael Day, and he's in charge of the Coast Guard's assets in the entire Pacific, being in charge of trying to make sure that the entire range of efforts from helping to try to deal with fires and floods, but also storms and the rescue of boaters out there, as well as interdiction of stuff that should not be coming to the United States, is all under his command. In fact, when there were fires in Maui, the Coast Guard was involved, and Michael Day was involved in trying to help get the Coast Guard's assets to where it is that they were needed. So is this something that can be rewarded? Well, the answer is, well, absolutely yes, because you have people who get to be experienced in producing outcomes. And so what we have is a world of government that's increasingly blended, a world that involves the role of not only government agencies, but also nonprofits, not only nonprofits, but for-profit organizations. We have cases where the real process of creating public value rests on this vast network, and the quest is to try to find ways of coordinating all of the pieces so that they don't get in each other's way. This is not only the way in which we've been able to solve individual major crises, like the effort to try to deal with the collapse of the towers and the evacuation of people off Manhattan, but it also has to do with the way in which we need to run government on a daily basis, because the vending machine model is obsolete. The idea of having one organization that can somehow be in control of everything doesn't work, because we need symphony orchestras that play beautiful music together. And to make that work, we need not only skilled musicians who can contribute to the music, but also great conductors who can serve as the bridge builders for the kind of problems that we need to solve. So let me stop there and see if I can find a way maybe to take part in some conversations. And with luck, maybe I've stimulated some ideas and some discussion.
Well, thanks for that, Don. I have a couple questions based on reading your book. One was, I noticed in the chapter talking about the importance setting cap goals during the Obama administration had, and really solving and addressing some big problems. And whenever I show that whole model to a nonprofit or a non-federal agency or a private enterprise, they kind of roll their heads, because that's not what they're used to having. Because they may have some goals with their partnerships and their ecosystems, but what challenge did you find that really helped make the cap goal process work?
The the thing that mattered most, and it's a lesson that comes across time after time after time, is you have individual organizations who understand that they do what they do, but also have leaders who become acquainted with the idea that they can't do everything themselves. Or if they try to do everything themselves, they'll leave important pieces out. It's getting a vision that goes beyond the actual operation and management of a program to people whose focus is to solve problems. And the key piece with CAP goals was to understand the importance of these horizontal connections and getting people who jump past the idea of managing the program to solving the problem, understanding that managing the program leaves parts of the problem unsolved, and that there are other partners who need to try to work with that. But on the other hand, who understand that it's mission that matters, and it's finding what is my contribution to the mission and who else do I need to work with to accomplish it. So in many ways, the fundamental problem with making the stuff work that we've talked about making work is the need, the imperative for trying to find ways of getting people to change their vision from I'm managing a program to I'm solving a problem, and I understand my contribution to solving that problem and others that I have to work with to try to make things work.
Yeah, and we had a question here, a comment from Brooke. It's the cross-agency priorities are the CAP goals, right?
Right, exactly, and they're goals that had been set by the both the Office of Management and Budget as part of the President's performance, presidential management agenda, but also increasing the imperative of trying to make things work. So it's cross-agency priority goals, by definition, are goals that require multiple organizations to work together. But to step back, this was an effort to try to solve some of the bigger problems that the administration was trying to focus on. But again, I challenge anybody to think of any problem that matters that any organization can control. So the CAP goals were just really a kind of point of the spear of the broader effort to try to manage these issues.
Got it. I have one more other observation from reading your book, and then I'll open it up to everyone online to ask questions, either a chat or be brave and take your mic off mute. There's one chapter you're talking about the power, and you mentioned in your introductory remarks about forging unity from diversity and bringing in diverse thoughts. And I forgot who you referenced in the book in terms of how that was one of the key ways they found bringing those different perspectives together really helped focus on solving the problem.
Yeah, and that's really important. We can just look across the board at virtually anything. And one of the more recent examples that popped up after we talked about the issues and challenges in the book is, if you look at the issue of migrants at the border and how to try to deal with the thousands and thousands of people who have streamed across, in many cases are now waiting for their court date to be able to determine whether or not their asylum applications are going to be approved. The question is, what happens 2 blocks away from the border? We deal with all the challenge. You see all the film of people trying to get across the river and trying to get through the barbed wire and get across the barriers. But what happens when they get in? And people, in fact, are legitimately waiting for their court date. It turns out that the federal agency that is in charge of resettlement of refugees has a grand total of 150 employees that try to deal with thousands of people. How does that work? And it turns out that the way it works, to the degree to which it works, is an effort to try to develop a fundamental approach that is based on bridge building. And there's a church pastor in in El Paso, whose job he's declared is to try to help the folks who are coming in. And so what they've been doing is to prepare food, to provide shelters for people to be able to stay on a temporary basis, to work with other nonprofits who are responsible for other pieces, to develop transportation systems to try to make things work. And so it's this sense that you have an individual who is in the country now legally waiting for their place in line for a court date, but need a whole variety of different services. And it's developed a shared vision that my job is not to try to be pastor of my church, but to try to help solve the problems of the people who are coming in. And the federal agency that's in charge of this is that has to do this, has to rely on this, because again, if you've got an agency with only 150 employees, dealing with this, as well as other refugees who need resettlement from places like Ukraine, then you've got to develop a strategy that builds on pushing the agency boundaries aside and then focusing fundamentally on trying to develop the shared vision.
Well, let me open it up to either Woody or our co-host or others online for questions from Don. To Don. Don't be shy, Woody. Gotta take yourself off mute.
Yeah, thanks. My network crashed earlier. We just when you introduced me, I lost connection, so I missed the first part of your presentation. But glad to be back online. Yeah, I enjoyed the presentation. I haven't read the book, but I did have a couple of comments or questions on the CAP goals. That was abandoned during the Trump administration, but the current administration, have they resurrected that in some other form, or do you see that happening through, like, for example, interagency commissions or task force or White House coordinating groups? There doesn't seem to be a formal cap goal program anymore.
Yeah, I think part of it, there's a long and storied and complicated history about just the challenge of trying to find ways of getting agencies mobilized, because if there's anything that seems to be a truism, that but to the point that's not even worth mentioning, it's that agencies often are constrained by their boundaries and by their vision about what it is that they ought to do. Yeah. And the president's management agendas for increasingly through the beginning with the Obama administration, it marked a transition from previous efforts simply to get people to pay attention to performance and to results. There was the first phase of the president's management agendas through especially the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration had to do with managing and putting ways of getting the issue of results squarely on the table. But then after that, the question is now what to do. And then in the Obama administration, there was the beginning of the effort to focus on these cross-agency priority goals, with the recognition that the goals that often needed to be achieved by collaboration among different agencies. So we've got that as a clear focus, and have that as an important piece to try to identify ways of moving forward. The Trump administration had a different approach to the management agenda and pushed that aside, in part because if there's any gospel in addition to the proposition that agencies are constrained by their boundaries, it's that every new administration has to blow up the previous management agenda of the one before and to try to come up with something completely new. And so the Trump people did that, and then the Biden people pushed that aside as well. But there's a new focus on serving customers, and serving customers by definition requires a way to try to transform the system from managing programs to managing for success in terms of serving individuals. And when you start serving individuals, you have individuals with often multiple needs, and multiple needs means that you have to find ways of developing a collaboration framework to be able to make that work. So that there is this enduring piece, along with the fact that now with the Government Performance and Management Reform Act, Part 2 requires a series of strategic plans and efforts to try to deal with this that stretch across administrations. Instead of 4 years, it's 5 years. And with 5 years mean that by definition, you have to cross the boundary from one presidential administration and one election to the next. And so we have that basic issue and challenge of trying to figure out how to get at that. So that's a really important set of issues and transformations to be able to go forward with that. And we've got, I think, some pretty remarkable ways of making things happen. I've talked to some people inside the Office of Management and Budget, and they have a really tiny staff of about a dozen in charge of trying to manage all of these things. But instead of trying to manage it by issuing regulations, they're managing it by trying to find ways of building partnerships. And so they've got with this dozen people, a close network of about 150, and then it's percolated out to hundreds more throughout the government who are enlisted in this, so that their effort to try to attack these issues has not been by issuing rules and creating requirements, but rather to try to build partnerships. That is, they want to see themselves as the orchestra conductor to be able to make some of this stuff happen.
That makes sense to me, because the 5-year, a 1-year overlap, that's going to be still a challenge in itself, right? And almost every consulting company that I worked for, they're always trying to make sure the outgoing leader has a legacy to leave behind. And when the new leader comes in, they tried to say, okay, how do we keep the legacy going to finish off what wasn't done yet? And how do we create your new one? And it could be a swirl for some folks, for sure.
Right, absolutely. But that's the real challenge. And there's a tension going on now that I think is important to recognize. That and it goes back to the Schedule F debate about whether or not federal employees ought to serve at the pleasure of the president. It's the question of continuity on the one side versus direct accountability to political leaders on the other. There's the argument that elections matter, so that new officials ought to be able to come in and to be able to transform the way the agencies operate, and that they ought to be able to put a stamp on what they're doing. But the more that you put a focus on that, which is, of course, a legitimate argument, that the more that you risk undermining the long-term partnerships that are required to get things done, because there's no problem that matters that is either time-bound by administration or functionally bound by the structure of an agency. I will say one thing: people who know me know that I'm ruthlessly nonpartisan, to the degree to which I possibly can be, but which means that I end up having annoying my friends a good part of the time. But a good core of the problem is, if you look at the Heritage Project 2025 transition guide, which, by the way, if you buy 2 of them, they're 900 pages each or so, and you can use them for dumbbells to be able to build your biceps. How often can you do public policy and build your biceps at the same time? But the biggest challenge, I think, in that book is that it is all organized by agency, and the problems we're trying to solve are not. And so that is the big challenge, I think.
Have you seen this work the same way at the state or local level in terms of changing of administrations, or is it just so much visible to us here in DC because of the focus on the federal side? Don?
I think that one of the things we tried to do in the book is that we looked in particular at the state and local stuff as well. As you can tell, we're especially impressed by the effort in Houston, and so the issues of homelessness. And I think that's a great case study, because the places that have been successful and have made progress are the ones who have found ways of doing bridge building well, and the ones that are struggling are ones that have found themselves hung up on the existing procedures and practices. I think that we've got a problem here in Austin, same state structure, same basic set of problems, where we've been really struggling to try to deal with the question of homelessness. And it's because both the collection of the data and the management of the money has tended to be very stovepiped. And as a result of that, we've had problems in comparison with what it is that's happened in Houston. Whenever it is that you see success, whether it's in mass transit or job training, or if you look at economic development or other issues, whenever you see success, the more these days you will see bridge building.
Woody?
I just one more follow-up. Setting aside that tension between continuity and accountability, how do you have any recommendations for how you incentivize managers to work across those agency boundaries, as opposed to staying within their silo or within their bureaucracy? It seems like that's one of the challenges, is that you don't get promoted, or you don't advance. Although your story about Michael Day is interesting, but in general, you don't advance by working horizontally with other organizations. There's not a lot of incentives to do that.
Yeah, and that's a big problem, and that's the thing that we I think have heard most. I think that the 2 key problems are, first, recognizing just how fundamentally the nature of service delivery has changed away from the vending machine model to more of the orchestra-based piece, and therefore the more that bridge builders are essential. And so we've got that. But on the other hand, the counter argument so often is that the world just doesn't work that way, that government's not structured that way, the politics don't work that way, the complaints about government don't work that way, except that if you pick up your favorite article criticizing government's problems, some failure the government has had somewhere doing something, and this goes state and local as well as federal, I would bet that far more often than not, the problem is rooted in the basic problem of a failure to try to conceptualize the issue as one that requires collaboration across agencies. And effective work at the state and local level increasingly is working in this dimension. We've got you can see both downtown alliances of businesses working with government to try to develop new pieces and new strategies. I was talking to a nurse one time. I had to be hospitalized overnight. Just one of these things where they just want to keep an eye on you, and if you're going to be kept an eye on overnight, that the key is to make sure, of course, that no matter what happens, you don't get an instant of sleep. And so had a nurse who came in at 2 o'clock in the morning to check the vitals, and so I was awake and he was working and he wasn't especially busy, and we started talking, and he was a firefighter here in Austin before becoming a nurse. And I said, boy, the business of firefighting here, given all the high rises sprouting up all over Austin, has got to be a huge challenge. And he said, yeah, well, it is, but we put out we save more lives and avoid more fires these days by things we put in the building code to make buildings safer than we do by spraying water on them. I was thinking, wow, what he's really telling me is that the success at the local level in reducing fires and fire damage and fire deaths have come through the partnership between government and the private sector and transforming the building codes. Let's think about that. That's amazing. And given the fact that I was awake anyway, I was at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I knew there's no chance of my getting sleep until they came in 2 hours later to check the vitals again, started running this through my mind, and there it was. It's a clear example about how this works.
So we had a comment in the chat from someone from the Department of Veterans Affairs who said they had success in reducing veterans homelessness by working with HUD on housing grants. Did you find the same thing in Houston, where they were working with getting grants from whether it was HUD or a state agency?
Yes, and it turns out, first of all, one of the things that the people in Houston have told me and have complained about is that the state too often, sadly, is an impediment to trying to make this work, and they complain that they're trying to build these partnerships, and the states with its patterns of funding get in the way. The key is trying to find ways of developing funding that's focused on outcomes, with outcomes focused on the efforts to try to accomplish this. And it turns out that the two sides to that veterans homelessness issue. You may remember not too long ago that the challenge of veterans homelessness was one that was on the news on a regular basis. It was really a terrifying set of videos that you would see on the evening news, because they had people who had served their country honorably and nobly and ended up in a situation where they were homeless. And the question was, how could we possibly allow that to happen? And the answer is that the solutions required a cross-agency network between the VA, which is in charge of managing many of the benefits, but also Health and Human Services, which had its own programs. And too often those two were not really being coordinated. The success that happened was the ability to be able to pull those pieces together. So that was the good side. The downside, and I talked to Donovan when he was director of OMB after having been secretary of HUD, is that he said it took him the better part of a year just to define what homelessness was in a way, in a language that both agencies could find a way to sync up with. And so that's kind of an example of the nature of the problem. But you're exactly right that the VA has had tremendous success, and they've done it by combining the care and the programs that the VA provides on the one side with housing that is something that is being provided by HUD through housing grants.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. I want to make sure that everyone who has a question or a comment can get on, take their mic off mute and ask Don a question or provide an observation. I got a bunch of introverts here, Don.
So the interesting question about whether or not bridge building requires more introverts or extroverts, and just
Yeah. Well, I think the person who asked that question, she's an introvert, works in an extroverted world. So I think you have to work on both.
But
So
the point I guess I would want to make is it's sort of it's a great question, kind of fun one, but it's an important one because the reaction to some people sometimes is, well, yeah, okay, I get this, but man, I could never do that myself. I could never take the risk. I could never lean forward. I could never try to get myself in that. Or boy, Fat Alan was amazing in New Orleans, but I'm no Fat Alan. But the question is, first, I mean, how do we create the kind of training and cultures that encourage the development of this style of leadership? Secondly, how do we understand how we can incorporate the individual skills of different people to be able to make this work? And there's an important role for the most introverted data wonk in this world by finding ways of creating dashboards that allow you to track what's going on. Incredibly powerful messaging that you can do that way. So there's a role for everybody in that way. And then finally, I think there's an important recognition that there's a generational change going on in government. And there are a lot of news stories that say, look, we've got Gen Z and there's friction between the millennials who are managing and Gen Z, who are the new generation of workers, and they're not really getting along. And we got boomers retiring who don't understand any of this stuff. But the reality is that we've got a new generation of workers who by instinct are outcome-based and who are network-driven and are technologically savvy. And so there's an opportunity here for being able to make the important changes that we want to make through the kind of hiring that we're going to need to be doing, as people whose hair is roughly my color are going to be retiring from the workforce.
Good point. We have a question or comment from Brooke.
Yeah, I know you kind of touched on it, but I'm struck by the lack of the focus on funding in this conversation, because regardless of what the age you have, you got people walking into an organization, regardless of what they've grown up with, and people in organizations do what they teach others to be successful with, and they're successful based upon what Congress and the funders are telling them to do, earmarking money. So like, it's similar to the concept of collective outcome in social service organizations. If you can, it goes back to what's being funded. If you're funding individual agencies and individual programs, or if you're funding a solution. And so changing the culture words are kind of nice and good to have, but it's not getting at one of the major root issues.
Yep. No, I could not agree more. And one of the things that I touched on very briefly was the importance of aligning incentives. And if you've got a system where people say, "Oh yeah, this sounds like a good idea, but I can't do it because my hands are tied because of the stream of funding and the way in which Congress has appropriated it." Because to be clear, of one of the reasons why we have so many deep silos in government is because Congress itself is the ultimate of silos, and we've got committees and subcommittees and jurisdictional boundaries and jurisdictional rivalries where members of Congress fight, sometimes not fist fights, but have fights among themselves about who's in charge of particular pieces because they want to be able to claim credit for the programs they're creating. But two things. One is that some members of Congress are getting this increasingly. And I have 3 points. The second point is that members of Congress, in my experience at least, have never complained about programs that work well. And so if the ways of being able to use the flexibilities to create that alignment, and there's usually not a whole lot of complaint about finding ways of the equivalent of mail delivered yet again kinds of headlines, that the kinds of things that happen. And the last point is that absolutely recognize and accept and appreciate and want to try to change the issues that that you've described, because we need to do a far better job to align the nature of what we're trying to do with the funding that we've got. But at the same time, I think that the managers often have more flexibility to do what needs to be done in a sensible bridge building kind of way than often they take advantage of. Because one of the things that, in fact, to go back to a couple of the cases, and Thad Allen came in and nothing had changed, except the problem had gotten worse and the news media attention and criticism had grown. But he succeeded in turning things around, even within the existing patterns of funding and resources, and found ways of getting people just to essentially to play nice with each other, trying to make things work. So that the real problem is trying to get at that. But Ellen's got a great question here. We fed an island to, and responding to Hurricane Maria and Puerto Rico. That was a recent failure because of a lack. To be clear, first of all, the logistical challenges were enormous, trying to ship lots of stuff to Puerto Rico, and given the infrastructure was so badly damaged. But a big part of the problem too had to do with the lack of management capacity in Puerto Rico and otherwise. How can government become more problem focused? In a nutshell, I mean, first of all, Jose Andres is amazing at that. What does he do? There's an emergency, there's a disaster, people are hungry. He comes in, and the way he does it is not by bringing hundreds of his own chefs in, but by coming in and galvanizing the existing local infrastructure, and by providing kind of leadership and funding, as well as infrastructure support to be able to make things work. So we've got that as the focus on problems. That's the challenge. Again, the counter to that is, well, yeah, okay, but that's in the middle of an emergency. But there's nothing to prevent people from doing that on a day-to-day basis too, on top of that. And again, I don't for a second minimize the complexity of doing this and doing it well, but it is that there's more flexibility for managers to operate in this kind of way, as in fact the HUD and the VA proved. Without, my recollection is that they didn't have a single act of Congress changed to be able to create an effective strategy dealing with homelessness among veterans. They just found ways of working more effectively together. And so that's sort of the great and overriding message that I think comes through here.
Well, Don, I think we're going to have to leave it here. I've got a couple of slides to kind of close off this webinar. If you have other questions or comments while I'm and Woody are just talking a few more minutes, please put in the chat so it's recorded. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. So Dr. Bat here. So NCAA chapter, we've got a little bit over 100 members. From a chapter perspective, we are the largest member chapter in ISP's ecosystem. Most of our members are split between government, education, and orgs, plus those squirrely types like myself as a consultant. And the government community practice has really expanded outside the national capital area. They've got 14 different countries where members are part of that community. They also have counties, and they have local jurisdictions members. What do you want to say a couple words about how you want to run, and are you running the government community practice with your tenants?
Yeah, well, thanks. On that previous slide, one of the things there, we're trying to reach out to other countries. Right now, we have about 70% of our members are from US and Canada, but we are beginning to see additional countries being represented in that mix, and also less federal involvement, federal agency involvement, and more local governments, and where there's a big opportunity given the number that there are. So tomorrow, actually, we're doing a webinar featuring Spruce Grove, Alberta, which is a small city, the county of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and the country Qatar, and we'll be talking about how they develop goals and objectives in their strategic plan. So that's just an example of the kinds of things we've been doing all year, with these monthly webinars. So I think some of the people who are on the call probably already know all this and have seen this before, but we do have these 3 tenets, which are sharing knowledge, learning, and then connecting and networking. And of course, in the learning area, we have the certification program. The association has a certification program, 2 levels for gaining through the body of knowledge that's been written by Jim and Pierre Hadea in Montreal. So that's good. And then the sharing and networking are things that we're trying to cultivate more and more. Tomorrow we'll have a discussion among all who participate about how, once they heard the presentations, they'll have a chance to talk to each other about some of the challenges they face in setting their goals and objectives. So appreciate, again, Don, your presentation, and I hope we can see you come back again in the future.
Yes, that's great. Big thank you, Don, for taking care of the wonderful slides, wonderful storytelling, which is another key point in your book. You have so many good points there, and that was a key point, is finding people to tell stories to help bring people aligned and focus on what that problem is. For us in the National Capital area, we're going to have another author series coming up either in December or January, just trying to finalize schedules. And also we're trying to herd a number of folks together to have a panel discussion with the Partnership for Public Service on the Futures Lab that they built, and how government agencies can take advantage of building foresight into their strategic thinking practices. So look out for those 2 events. They'll be coming out shortly. And if you have any questions, just see our website for all of our contact information. And I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Bye,
So
everyone.
great to be with you. And always happy to continue this conversation with anybody at any point. You take good care and continued great success with what you're doing.
Thank you much. Bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye now.